Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We love to go deep on really fascinating topics, and today is no exception, especially if you're into international relations.
Yeah, if you're fascinated by how the world works, how countries interact, the whole global power play, you're going to love this one.
It's going to be a good one. And you know what? If you happen to be a UPSC aspirant with international relations as your subject, well, then consider this like required listening.
Absolutely. The text we're diving into today is pretty much a must-read for anyone serious about understanding how the world has transformed since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, it covers a lot of ground. We're talking about like everything from that brief moment of like post-Cold War optimism. Remember that whole New World Order idea?
Oh yeah, President Bush Sr. and that whole vision of a world where democracy and cooperation would prevail.
To the rise of global terrorism, and it obviously changed things dramatically.
And of course, we can't forget about the global economy, the ups and downs, the winners and losers, and how new players like China and India are really shaking things up.
Yeah, it's a wild ride. And you know what? I think what makes this deep dive so valuable is that it's not just about looking back. It's about understanding the forces that are still shaping our world today.
Exactly. It's about seeing the patterns, connecting the dots, and getting a better grasp of how we got to where we are now.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's rewind back to the end of the Cold War. For a lot of people, it felt like this huge victory, like finally the good guys won, democracy was triumphant.
There was this sense of relief, this hope that maybe, just maybe, we had finally turned a corner.
The Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union collapses. It felt like a new era was beginning.
And there was this real belief that international cooperation would be the norm, that countries would work together to solve problems.
And there were some early successes that kind of fueled this optimism, right?
Yeah, I mean, you had the Gulf War in 1991.
Right.
A broad coalition comes together, pushes back against Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. It felt like a textbook example of the international community acting decisively to uphold the rules-based order.
The UN was actually working the way it was supposed to.
Exactly. And then you had things like the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE.
Which later became the OSCE, right?
Right. It aimed to promote dialogue and prevent conflict in Europe, and it had some real successes, especially in areas like human rights and arms control.
So there were reasons to be optimistic, right? It felt like we were entering this new world order where things would be different.
But as we know, it didn't quite work out that way.
Yeah, that new world order thing, it turned out to be a lot more complicated than people initially thought.
I mean, the end of the Cold War, it brought about a whole new set of challenges. The old bipolar system with the US and the Soviet Union as these rival superpowers, it had kind of kept a lid on a lot of regional and ethnic conflicts.
It's like when you remove a big heavyweight from something, suddenly all these smaller weights start shifting around and bumping into each other.
Yeah, and the text uses the disintegration of Yugoslavia as a prime example of this.
Which is really interesting because we often think of the fall of the Berlin Wall as this peaceful revolution.
Right, but the breakup of Yugoslavia was anything but peaceful. It was a brutal civil war marked by ethnic cleansing and terrible violence.
And it really showed the limitations of this new world order. The international community, despite all its good intentions, was really slow to react effectively.
And the Bosnian War in particular became this tragic symbol of that failure.
It's a stark reminder that even with the best of intentions, things can go horribly wrong.
And it highlighted a really important point: the nature of conflict had changed. Instead of these large-scale wars between superpowers, we are now seeing more internal conflicts, often driven by ethnic or religious divisions.
And for anyone studying international relations, this is a key takeaway. The changing nature of conflict in the post-Cold War world, it's a major theme, and it's something you really need to understand.
It challenges our traditional ideas about war and peace, and it forces us to think differently about how to prevent and resolve conflicts.
So we've got this fragile post-Cold War world trying to figure itself out, still grappling with these new types of conflicts, and then bam, 9/11 happens.
It was a moment that completely changed the game.
It wasn't just the scale of the attacks. It was
Yeah.
the realization that a relatively small group of non-state actors could inflict so much damage and create so much fear.
Yeah, it really exposed the vulnerability of even the most powerful nations.
And suddenly terrorism, which had always been a concern, it became the dominant security threat. The world entered a new era, the era of the war on terror.
And to understand this new threat, you really have to understand the complexities of the Middle East, which is where we're going to pick up in the next part of this deep dive.
Yeah, things are about to get even more interesting. So make sure you stick around for part 2. I mean, it seems like every time you turn on the news, there's something happening in the Middle East.
Right. It's this constant cycle of conflict and instability. But to really understand what's going on, you have to look beyond the headlines. You have to understand the historical context.
That's what I think is so fascinating about this text. It really digs deep into the history of the region.
Yeah, it goes way back and it highlights some key factors that have contributed to the instability we see today.
And I think one of the biggest factors has to be the legacy of colonialism.
Right.
I mean, European powers had a huge impact on the Middle East.
It's hard to overstate their influence. I mean, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they basically carved up the region among themselves, drew borders that often ignored existing ethnic and cultural divisions.
Yeah, it's like they were playing a game of Risk with real people's lives.
Exactly. And they created these artificial states, stoked rivalries, sowed the seeds for future conflicts.
And then, of course, you add in the discovery of oil and things get even more complicated.
Oil, it's been both a blessing and a curse for the Middle East.
Yeah. On the one hand, it brought immense wealth to some countries.
Right, but it also led to corruption inequality and this dependence on external powers.
And then there's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been going on for decades.
It's a source of so much tension and violence, and it has this huge symbolic impact, not just in the region, but around the world.
It's a really complex issue with deep historical roots.
Absolutely, and it's intertwined with all these other factors like nationalism, religion, the struggle for self-determination.
So you've got all of this going on, these historical grievances, unresolved conflicts, economic disparities.
And it's in this environment that political Islam starts to gain traction.
That offered this really powerful narrative,
Yeah.
right? Like a way to resist Western influence and return to Islamic values as a solution to the region's problems.
Exactly. And you see groups like the Muslim Brotherhood emerging, advocating for political reform based on Islamic principles.
And then, of course, in 1979, you have the Iranian Revolution, which really shook things up.
Yeah, that was a turning point. It established an Islamic republic, and it inspired other Islamist movements, some of which turned to violence to achieve their goals.
Groups like Hamas and Hezbollah challenging Israel, but also the broader regional order.
And then, of course, you have al-Qaeda, which really brought the threat of global terrorism to the forefront with the 9/11 attacks.
And I think that's why it's so important to understand the Middle East. It's not just some faraway region that we can ignore.
What happens there has a direct impact on the rest of the world.
And to counter terrorism effectively, you have to understand its root causes. And those root causes are often found in the complexities of the Middle East.
Exactly. And speaking of 9/11, that obviously led to a major shift in U.S. foreign policy.
The war on terror became the top priority.
And the U.S. responded with military force first in Afghanistan, then in Iraq.
Yeah, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 that had pretty broad international support, it was seen as a justified response to 9/11.
It was even authorized by the UN Security Council.
But then the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that was a lot more controversial.
The Bush administration argued that Saddam Hussein's regime posed a threat because of its alleged weapons of mass destruction program and its ties to terrorism.
But of course, no WMDs were ever found.
And the invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq, it proved to be incredibly costly, both in terms of human life and financial resources.
And a lot of people argue that it actually destabilized the region even further.
Yeah, it definitely fueled anti-American sentiment and arguably created more problems than it solved.
The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they really highlight the challenges of intervention in the post-Cold War world.
Even with overwhelming military power, it's really difficult to achieve lasting stability and peace.
It's a lesson that policymakers and anyone interested in international relations should really take to heart.
You have to understand the complexities, the unintended consequences, the limits of hard power.
And I think the Obama administration recognized this when they came to power in 2009.
Yeah, they shifted away from large-scale military interventions and focused more on diplomacy, development aid, and what's often called soft power.
They tried to engage with the Muslim world in a more nuanced and respectful way.
It was a recognition that military force alone wasn't the answer.
So we've talked about the end of the Cold War, the rise of new types of conflicts, the complexities of the Middle East, the war on terror. But there's another really important piece of the puzzle that we need to talk about.
The global economy.
Yeah, the end of the Cold War didn't just reshape the political landscape, it also coincided with this new phase of globalization. And that's where things get really interesting. It's wild to think how much the world has changed since the end of the Cold War. I mean, it wasn't just about politics shifting, it was the whole global economy too.
Yeah, it really kicked off this whole new phase of globalization. Some call it accelerated globalization even.
And the text argues that this new phase, it was actually way more significant than the Cold War itself in a lot of ways.
It's a bold claim, but when you think about the impact on people's everyday lives, It makes you wonder.
For sure. I mean, it talks about the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Remember that? The one that had been in place since after World War II?
Right. That was the system that regulated international finance, and when it collapsed, it created a sort of vacuum.
And that's where the Washington Consensus comes in, right?
Exactly. That's the set of ideas that basically took over free market policies, trade liberalization, privatization.
Like the recipe for economic success, according to, well, Washington.
And it did have some successes. I mean, a lot of countries, particularly in Asia, saw some serious economic growth as they opened up to global markets.
Yeah, but the text also points out that it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Oh, absolutely. There were some serious downsides, too. I mean, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution, and for a lot of developing countries, it meant some really tough economic adjustments.
It's like that saying, to the victor go the spoils. Some countries were definitely better equipped to reap the benefits of globalization than others.
Right, and the text actually mentions the financial crises that hit Mexico, Asia, and Argentina in the 90s and early 2000s.
Ouch, yeah, those were rough.
Those crises really exposed how vulnerable the global financial system was and how unevenly the benefits of globalization were being distributed.
It's like some countries were riding the wave while others were getting crushed by it.
It's a great analogy, and this is where the rise of these new economic powerhouses like China and India becomes really important.
It's like the balance of power is shifting, right?
Absolutely. I mean, for centuries, the economic center of the world was firmly in the West, but now it's moving eastward towards Asia.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
And China especially, I mean, their growth over the past few decades has been unlike anything we've ever seen.
Yeah, they've become the world's factory,
Yeah.
a major player in global trade, a huge investor in other countries.
The text even suggests that China could overtake the U.S. as the world's largest economy within the next few years.
Wow, that would be a seismic shift.
It would, and then you have India right there with them. I mean, their population is massive. Their tech sector is booming. They're definitely a force to be reckoned with.
It's like the world is being remade right before our eyes.
It really is. And for anyone studying international relations or even just trying to understand how the world works, this is crucial stuff.
You have to understand the dynamics, the trends, the historical context. It's all connected.
It's not just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about seeing the bigger picture and being able to analyze how these shifts are going to play out.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. So let's take a moment to recap what we've learned. We started with the end of the Cold War, this moment of hope and optimism for a new world order.
But as we've seen, things haven't exactly gone according to plan.
We've talked about the rise of new types of conflicts, the complexities of the Middle East, the threat of global terrorism, and of course the wild ride of the global economy.
And through it all, we've seen how the balance of power is shifting, how new players are emerging, and how the old rules are being rewritten.
It's a lot to take in, but it's also incredibly fascinating, and I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the forces that are shaping our world.
Absolutely. And if you're a UPSC aspirant, make sure you take good notes because this stuff is definitely going to come up on the exam.
For sure. And for everyone else, whether you're a seasoned international relations buff or just someone who's curious about the world we live in, we hope you found this deep dive insightful and thought-provoking.
And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with anyone who might be interested.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring, and stay engaged.